Good morning, one and all. Thank you a lot for joining us for this webinar today. My name is Adnan, and I handle marketing for QuestionPro for Middle East region. And today's topic is the future of employee engagement and positivity at the workplace, and all the things that you need to do to promote and sustain employee well-being. And now Vivek will take over.
Hello, everybody. So we move on to the next slide. I am joined here with David and Radhika over here. David and Radhika are the founders of an amazing company in Dubai called the Talent Enterprise, and actually great friends of mine too. And I'm super excited about having them in the webinar today. Fun fact about David, he actually rode a motorcycle all the way from Dubai to London, which is, I'm incredibly jealous of that. He took the time to do it. And another fun fact about Radhika, actually, is that she doesn't drive. It's amazing. She's single-handedly kept Uber in business, I guess. So the three of us are going to run this webinar today, and we want to talk about, and very interesting research that David and Radhika have done around kind of employee engagement, kind of practices, best practices, and also we want to talk a little bit about our technology that is empowering some of the kind of ideas that we have. So that's what we're going to talk about. We have about an hour, so let's get to it. Let's go on to the next slide. David, take it away.
Sure. Okay. Well, listen. Thank you very much, Adnan and Vivek, for the introduction. Really, what I want to do is put the discussion about employee engagement in context. And in our work at the Talent Enterprise, often we're dealing with clients, and these are, I guess, some of the things that they tend to share with us in terms of some of the challenges and some of the opportunities with employee engagement as they've experienced it as projects within their organization. So often, I mean, from a very practical point of view, many people understand the concept, but they want to know how do they actually run an employee engagement project or survey, maybe for the first time, or maybe in terms of trying to re-energize their existing approach to employee engagement. So we'll try and keep it practical in the time that we have together in this webinar. And of course, answer your questions at the end. I think also there's this aspect of renewing employee engagement. So I think many of you who would have worked in HR or related disciplines for some time will know, and if you're old enough like me to remember things like employee satisfaction surveys, and then the introduction of employee engagement as a concept, and even now some of the new ideas that hopefully we'll share with you in our session together. They want to know about new ideas, new approaches, how to keep it fresh, how to keep it real. So that's really, I think, the second and third areas. And then often when it comes to senior sponsorship and stakeholders, then we really need to know, like, okay, so what's the point of this? Okay, is it a sort of nice cuddly cardigan from HR in the organization? Radhika is a psychologist, and she'll talk a little bit more from the positive psychology perspective. But honestly, it's not just a nice cuddly approach to how we do it. It should have very clear impact on the bottom line, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also, again, I think mostly from Radhika's perspective as a positive psychologist, I think particularly in the Middle East, whether it's from Saudi Arabia in the National Transformation Program, or in the UAE and Dubai specifically, we see many governments are driving a happiness agenda, which has an impact then obviously on things like well-being and organizational engagement within organizations and from an employer perspective as well. So we'll cover some of those as we go through.
Thank you, David. A little bit about QuestionPro. I started QuestionPro about 10 years ago, and we are, as a software platform, fundamentally, we help companies collect insights. So there are three different pieces of our business. One is consumer insights and market research, where we allow companies to kind of look into the future and understand what kind of products and services to build through the notion of surveys and communities. The second piece of our business is customer experience, where we kind of help companies look at existing customers and figure out what's working and what's not working. And the third piece is HR, which is we allow companies to peer into the minds of their employees and understand the workplace behavior and the workforce in general. So that's kind of what we do at an abstract level. At a more practical level, we have offices, here in the States, which is in San Francisco, in Chicago, as well as in Salt Lake City, and we have an office in Mexico, Merida, in a place called Merida, rather, that handles all our Latin America business, and in Germany. And then about 3 months ago, rather, we started up an office in Dubai, and of course, we have kind of our global operations running out of India also. We do about, just to give you guys some perspective, we do about 3 million surveys per week across our entire platform, and obviously we can be used in over 100+ languages. So we're fairly global in terms of kind of running operations, and we are super excited to be in the Middle East. Like I said, we started up our operations in Dubai about 3.5 months ago, and we look at the Middle East as a pretty emerging market, and a pretty actually fairly interesting and emerging market, and that's why we're super excited about partnering up with the talented guys like David and Radhika, who've kind of explored this market and done a ton of research in this market for quite a while. So, David.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Vivek. And I think very much in our collaboration with QuestionPro, we also at the Talent Enterprise, we love the analytics, very much focused in the talent space. As you can see, we focus very much on things like employee engagement, which is obviously the topic for today. But we do a lot of work also in psychometric assessments, leadership, diversity and inclusion, employability, nationalization, very much about making change happen from a people perspective. We call ourselves a think and a do tank. So the research and the publications and the analytics which we undertake are really a vehicle for us and for our clients to then develop very practical tools and strategies to help improve things like employee engagement, productivity, making sure you get the right people in the right place at the right time. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. We've been in existence for almost 6 years now as an organization, although both Radhika and myself have been working in the region for quite some time. And we're very proud that whilst we're firmly based within the Middle East, we're starting to develop the business into other geographies as well, which gives us some, again, interesting dimensions to our analytics.
Great. Thank you, Vivek and David, for the introduction. I'm just going to reintroduce the agenda a little bit. So in terms of where we're going to focus for the next 40 minutes or so is really talking about some of the questions that you might have, some of the things you might have seen, because as we know, engagement and increasingly happiness are extremely popular topics. They're, you kind of read LinkedIn and you probably see 10 to 15 posts every hour on similar topics. But what's going on, sort of what is the context? Is it really kind of repackaging old thoughts and old thinking? So a little bit around that. Then we're really going to talk about some facts about where we are today from what we understand about engagement and happiness. And then really try and give you all who are on the webinar today some really practical tips about where do you go from here. So as soon as you finish this webinar, when you go back to work tomorrow, what is it that you can think about differently? What is it that you can reconsider or consider as you continue to prioritize engaging, motivating, and developing your talent at work? So that really is the 3 things we want to try and cover over the next 40 minutes or so that we have together. And we'd be happy to take questions at the end as well. In terms of engagement, I mean, this figure, and I'll kind of leave it open for a while for all of you to read. I think it's always extremely striking, and it really takes me back. It's quite a shock because obviously, as I said before, engagement's an extremely popular topic. It's talked about a lot. It's something, like I said, it's become a fad. Like, there's a danger with HR about these things becoming fads. But interestingly, what really strikes me as different is that we seem to have a lot of talk about engagement, but we know very little about it from an academic or from a purely research standpoint. So although you'll get between 650 and 1 million hits on engagement, if you try and go do a Google search, there'll be lots of white papers and perspectives on it. Academically, this is quite shocking. We only have about 30 articles in quality peer-reviewed journals around engagement and what drives engagement. So for a topic that's very, very popular, we actually know very little, which is quite a surprise. The other thing which, there's a Professor Backer, who's probably one of the leading authorities on engagement. This was a book he wrote a few years ago. And this quote really stands out for me. And I think this is a trend we're seeing in HR generally, is the fact that, and we're consultants as well, we work with organizations, but it literally is one of those topics that have become very popular, driven by mainly a large consulting, business consulting and HR consulting market around it. And although everyone would claim that their approaches are different, everyone has their own models or points of view, what Professor Backer clearly says is it really comes, the way we see or hear about engagement is really kind of conceptualizing or putting old wine in new bottles. It's about rebranding or repackaging old concepts like job satisfaction or, commitment to work, very traditional concepts that have been around in the 40s, 50s, and even 60s, and just kind of repackaging them. Because again, the research hasn't kept up with the popularity from an organizational perspective. So just something to think about as you guys work on engagement within your organizations. Happiness, I've been asked a lot of questions about happiness. This is something I've been studying and looking at as a concept and as trying to apply it into the work context for a long time. It's obviously become extremely popular again. I mean, if you just have to be in Dubai and you have to kind of drive around anywhere in the region, you see a lot of branding around happiness, big yellow smiley faces, a lot of service centers being renamed customer happiness centers. There's a happiness street we have in Dubai. And again, I think the point about this slide really is that it's a very important concept. It's a very, very core concept, both from an individual perspective and also an organizational perspective. But are we again trying, is the fad or the popularity taking, is it getting ahead of its time, or is it taking over what really is a very serious matter around how do you actually sustain and drive happiness for yourself, for your organization, but also much broadly towards the community as well. So we'll talk a little bit about what's the concept and how can you apply it, just to try and make it a little bit more practical. But for me right now, from what I see in the region at least, it really is becoming a case of emperor's new clothes, right? Again, things that are repackaged or just renamed or rebranded without really getting into the core of what the change might be. So just kind of staying on with happiness, because I've been asked this question a lot of times about what is happiness and what's the difference between the three. So very, very simply, this slide might help explain some of what happiness is. And I think it's a very easy way to explain it, typically saying there are 3 or 4 different pathways to happiness. The first, which is probably the one we all read about, the one that we see, is really about that sort of immediate pleasure. So how do you actually feel when you have a great meal, or when you get a promotion, or when you kind of have a great conversation with your colleague? It's sort of this short-term boost in your physiological boost as well as a psychological boost in your state, which feels good, right? And it feels good for a while and it lasts for a while. And then if you've had an amazing meal, maybe you start feeling guilty about how much you've overeaten that day. So it's a short-term boost and it kind of goes back to where you were before. And a lot of happiness initiatives, happiness programs within organizations, rightly so, are trying to focus a lot on these short-term boosts around happiness. The other two, and how it relates to engagement, is the second bit. So that really is about this concept of being really engaged into your work or into an area you really care about, and that creates a flow. So many of you might have been in experiences where you've really enjoyed a certain activity or a certain role you were playing, and then you kind of lost track of time, or you were so engaged and so passionate about what you were doing that everything else around you kind of blurred in the distance. And this really is about the passion and the flow and the engagement, and hence why these concepts are also very related. And the third aspect of happiness is around meaning. So how do you actually help individuals, communities, and societies create meaningful, purposeful lives? And how do you create a community or individuals who feel like they're contributing to a cause bigger than their own? And when we start moving into things like purpose and meaning, then it's very hard to create that from outside. You really have to start driving meaning and purpose and that sense of who you are and where you want to be. And that's much more of an internal pathway to happiness. So as you kind of look at these three pathways, some of this has an extrinsic or an external role to play, but a lot of this starts becoming about you and who you are. And also it becomes harder as you move into passion and purpose, not only in getting or feeling or experiencing happiness in this way, but also sustaining it over time.
And just to add to what Radhika is saying, I think when it comes to a practical application of this in terms of clients wanting to run an engagement project or an engagement survey, then these dimensions are underlying the execution of the project itself. So to what degree do people buy into the purpose of your organization? How much opportunity in their job design and in the way they interact with their colleagues and technology increasingly, do they get an opportunity to experience flow and passion in their work? And then, just on a very sort of hedonistic perspective, how much pleasure do they get out of the intrinsic nature of their work?
Yeah.
So all of these factors, I think, form the foundation on which the survey takes place. And often some of the questions we get about why engagement surveys are successful or not sometimes comes down to these underlying factors.
Yeah, and also to say, I think all three pathways are equally important, both for the individual and the organization, and focusing on only one or over-focusing on a certain area may kind of lead to it being sort of a half-baked approach towards holistic well-being or holistic engagement or happiness. Vivek, do you want to talk a little bit about what you see globally in terms of global trends around engagement and anything from your perspective?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think going back to the other slide, I mean, one of the things that, we did some research also, and one of the things that came out in terms of just pure kind of from an employee perspective, we kind of looked at all the different factors that make people kind of truly kind of getting the feeling of purpose and getting that feeling of flow. And from a kind of, what is it that matters, right? I mean, is it giving free meals? Does that matter? Or what are among all the factors that matter in terms of getting people excited about work or the workplace itself? And two things that came out, at least from the last research that we did. Two at least the things that actually stood out that factored in for job satisfaction is in general. Number one was does my supervisor care about my career? That was the kind of the answer to that question is very important. It's not about does my supervisor care about whether I had food in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like does my immediate supervisor care about? And we all say that people don't quit companies, people quit their supervisors. That's kind of pretty well researched and well talked about. And the counterpoint to that is really around like we need supervisors or supervisors and managers really to care about their people who report to them and their career, more importantly, at least for kind of job functions that are intellectual in nature. So that was a pretty kind of eye-opening kind of statement, and which if you can figure out a way to kind of, and that goes to your kind of statement around passion and purpose, because that it's a long-term. It's not just whether my supervisor cares about something I did yesterday or today, but more importantly as a career concept, am I progressing from a career perspective? So that was number one. The second one is where is the company going? Where is the kind of overarching? So one is something directly tied to my supervisor and my career. The other one is overarchingly, is the company going in the right direction? From a market perspective. So these two factors pretty much could determine a lot of kind of how employees feel and behave and operate within an organization, and it goes directly to your kind of long-term value creation through passion and purpose that you have over here. So those are the two kind of elements that I would probably add into this to say, like, it's these two elements about career progress and where the company is going are the two kind of important elements of determining how employees engage with an organization.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And yeah, we'll talk more about this towards the end as well, and what that really means from a very practical perspective.
Awesome. So let me kind of jump in over here in terms of kind of what is the kind of cost of engagement and disengagement effectively. I think there's lots of research that has been published even in the States over here in terms of about almost a third of the employees are actively disengaged. A few of them, half the employees are not engaged. So we like to kind of look at it from a perspective of there are people who have flow, people who are fired up about coming to work and getting the job done, and who are actively working towards it. And so what is the kind of the real cost associated with it? It is well documented in terms of the cost of disengagement is effectively massive loss of productivity, massive loss of kind of you're truly kind of people are not willing to go the extra mile, or even go the fundamental mile, if you will. And the real problem over here, if you notice, it's not really the 19%, is really the kind of the middle ground. As you can see, about half the employees are kind of neither engaged nor disengaged. So they are doing, that's what we call, at least B plus, effectively. And the real meat and potatoes of figuring out how to move the middle ground to the engaged concept effectively. If you can move even 10% of these folks from being disinterested, but not unproductive. See, that's the key part, right? They're disinterested, but relatively productive. And first of all, figuring out, I think the key elements over here are, number one, figuring out who these people are. Number two, what are the elements that you can put in play to move people from the middle ground, from the not engaged to the engaged capacity. So we'll talk a little bit about metrics and measurement later on, but in my opinion, this is the key element behind that. And then, as you can see over here, is the benefits of engaged employees. The economic benefits, the sheer economic benefits of engaged employees are tremendous. We've seen productivity go up the roof. People are creative. People, especially intellectually challenging jobs, people are creative. People come up with new ideas. People implement new ideas, and people are fired up about getting stuff done. And they take initiative, and that is the kind of fundamental reason why we have employees. We kind of have the saying, at least within QuestionPro, is like, we hire people for their brains and not for their muscle, effectively. And so and in order for people to kind of be actively kind of working on concepts and thinking about ideas and coming up with new solutions, they need to feel that they're part of a mission. They need to feel that they're part of something bigger than themselves, and not just a paycheck. So the question, it comes back to a couple of things. It comes back to measurement and metrics, and number two, kind of active planning around certain artifacts. And Radhika will talk about the active planning side in terms of what are the practical concepts that they've put in play, especially in the Middle East, that has worked and that has not worked. So that's kind of where we are in terms of engagement.
Okay,
David.
Thanks, Vivek. So again, thinking from the Middle East perspective in particular, what does some of our research tell us? And I mean, you'll see some of our publications throughout the rest of the slides. I'm not going to go into great detail, but the great detail is there if you want to look at some of these publications or follow up with us separately on that. But essentially, if you look at this Manhattan bar chart profile that you see in front of you, this is a very, very broad picture. Okay, so this is saying for all organizations who are conducting employee engagement exercises across these regions around the world, what is the average level of positive engagement within those organizations? Okay, and that's defined specifically in this case in terms of discretionary effort. I know there are lots of different definitions of employee engagement. In this case, we're looking at discretionary effort. So those people, as Vivek said, who are willing to put in the extra mile. And what you can see here, I think, is quite interesting. So whilst we should all give up our jobs now and go and work in Rio de Janeiro, obviously, is the answer to improving employee engagement, especially if you like surfing or whatever else you like, then that's the place to be. What we can see is that in the GCC, we're amongst the lowest on average in terms of discretionary effort globally. Now, this for me is very interesting and very thought-provoking, because if you think about the GCC workforce, and if you think about your organizations, then typically we've got some combination of GCC nationals who arguably from a HR policy and government policy perspective are highly supported in terms of their role and their development within the workplace, certainly over the last few decades. So this is interesting as to why we would still see relatively low levels amongst this population. And then obviously the other part of the workforce to a differing degree are made up of people like us who are expatriates who have chosen to come to the GCC and chosen to remain here and to build part or all of our careers here. So what's interesting to me is that whilst I think the ingredients are there, maybe there's some more work we can do in terms of getting the recipe right, because especially in the GCC, we're moving from a macro level from this energy dependent type of economy typically to one which is more knowledge based on human capital, and therefore the way we capture this human capital and this discretionary effort in our organizations is going to be critical for the competitiveness of this region going forward in the future. So I think whether it's on a micro level within your organization, even down to an individual level, whether it's on a sort of strategy level, I think clearly there's a great opportunity here to understand more about the drivers of engagement. I'm going to share a little bit more about that from our research, but also there's a great benefit from making that change happen. And then also when you look at the difference between the public sector and the private sector, you can see despite the fact within the GCC that on average, most public sector employees tend to get a much better set of employee benefits. So for instance, typically 60 days holiday a year, average levels of pay are higher, you tend to get shorter working hours, etc., 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 than in the private sector. You can see that from a statistical significance perspective, there's significantly lower levels of engagement within the public sector than in the private sector. And again, what's interesting for us and what's driven a lot of our research is that the provision of pay alone or benefits alone or working conditions more generally is not sufficient to drive positive employee engagement. And what's interesting is that, again, there's a great opportunity to understand and to analyze and to unpack that and to really understand how we can drive employee engagement, drive organizational performance on the basis of that. But it's not simply about increasing pay or improving benefits. And in many cases, maybe the excess provision of those aspects of the psychological contract are actually restraining the growth or the enhancement of employee engagement, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Another interesting dimension of employee engagement globally, but specifically in the region, is that we typically have this mid-career crisis. Now, I don't want to speak for Vivek or for Radhika, but speaking for myself, I would be somewhere in the middle of this range that you see here. In fact, coming towards the higher end. And typically in the rest of the world, what we see is that you have this mid-career crisis in terms of employee engagement, where there's a dip. You typically start your career highly enthusiastic, highly engaged. You want to learn, you want to build your capability, you want to get involved in many different things, develop different roles, etc. As your career gets to the middle level, you typically have the highest levels of responsibility, lower levels of resources available to you. You're really, I guess, on the sharp end in terms of having to perform. And then as you get towards the end of your career, typically you're either in the place that you want to be, or you've changed your expectations, and therefore typically employee engagement would go up towards the end of the career. Now, all of those factors tend to happen much quicker in the Middle East. So we see this phenomenon of an early mid-career crisis, where typically 12 years or more earlier than the average for the rest of the year. So in this 25 to 34-year-old age cohort is where we have the average lowest levels of employee engagement. Interestingly, this is often associated with things outside of the workplace, so things like family formation, even looking after the older generation. It's associated with things like highest levels of personal debt, also whether for GCC nationals or for expatriates, tend to happen at a younger age in this region than they happen elsewhere in the world. And all of these things together tend to drive more pressure on employee engagement and actually see the lowest levels here. So we have this early mid-career crisis. From our research, we see that this comes from the context of engagement in this region in particular, but also I think from expectations. We see people in the region, whether expatriates or GCC nationals, are typically very ambitious, and therefore the high expectations that they might start their career with sometimes get faced with stark reality much quicker, and they realize that the striving aspect of the workplace often comes before the thriving aspect of the workplace.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I mean, I think this is a big concern, and I wish we could spend more time on this, but the fact that our 25 to 34-year-olds, which is pretty much the majority of the population and the majority of our current and future workforce, are at their lowest in terms of engagement is quite shocking. And I think, like David rightly said, a lot of it is around expectations. Some of it is with considerations or pressures outside work, but our research has also shown from a psychological or behavioral perspective, a lot of it is about a lack of preparation for what to expect from work, but also when you kind of get into work, then there's also aspects around not having enough resilience to be able to deal with setbacks or deal with challenges. And a lot of young people in the region specifically are not prepared for these essential life skills. So we'd also done a follow-up study for this, and what we actually found was something that's talked about a lot around the education to employment sort of journey, and the fact that whether it's sort of direct relevance of what students are studying in academia related to work, whether it's preparation for work in general, and specifically around things like, do you have the grit, do you have the resilience, do you have the confidence, we find those to be quite low in the region. And I think that kind of gets very exaggerated when they get into fairly competitive work environments. So a lot going on from a youth perspective, and I think a lot more to be done from a policy, but also an organizational level around preparing the younger generation, and also kind of with these life skills, kind of having the right expectations, getting them to, spend more time much earlier at work, making the right career choices. So there's a lot of linkage to this, but the fact that there is this early mid-career crisis 10 years before anywhere else is definitely something to think about. Moving on, so I know we've tried to describe a little bit about the fact, just to summarize so far, about there is not enough research. These are popular concepts, but there's always a risk of the popularity taking over the science. We've talked a little bit about what's happening globally, which Vivek touched on, and then also David spoke about the region. And now really we want to spend the rest of the time together around where do we go from here. And our objective really over here is to kind of bust some myths or talk about some fairly fundamental shifts in thinking around how we think, conceptualize, understand, and also commit to aspects such as engagement. So we're going to go over six major points or six major facts one by one. So the first one really is, and I think this is something I struggle with a lot, is the fact. So if you look at a typical organization which invests in engagement, it starts with them talking about the engagement survey, right? And usually you'd spend 3 months planning the survey. If you're working with one of the consulting firms, you'd probably spend another 2 months waiting for the results. And it's 5 to 6 months before you've actually got data or information on where employee engagement, what are the levels of employee engagement. Then you spend time action planning, and then it's time, you probably spend maybe not as much time in terms of communication and actually doing something about those results. And then it's time for another survey to come in. The main fundamental shift for us really is that engagement's not a once in a year or once in 2 years measure. So it's actually quite flawed to say the employee engagement in my organization is 60%, and I measured this back in February. The main shift in engagement is that it is really actually a state. So it changes every day. It could change every month. It could change based on what's going on within the organization. So organizations with technology, and I know Vivek's going to talk a little bit about QuestionPro here, but organizations need to get smarter and more agile about measuring engagement on a much, much more regular basis. And I'd like to kind of connect this to customers. We don't wait for a year to find out if our customers are happy or unhappy with the product. We do such a good job of measuring that on an ongoing basis, and it really surprises me that we don't do the same for our internal customers or our employees. So just the fact that it's a state which needs a lot more ongoing intelligence around where people are, and is there a trend? Do you see dips in certain times of the year? Are there peaks in the organization and the organizational aspects of engagement? And technology can help do that in some pretty wonderful ways. Vivek, would you like to add here?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go on to the next slide. And so, Radhika, as you mentioned, one of the fundamental tenets of kind of like, I was talking to a colleague of mine, and we were just discussing around customer feedback, and how it's almost every single company in the planet today understands that understanding customer feedback is critical to business success. And with the advent of NPS, which is the Net Promoter Score, almost all companies have come up with some sort of a model for kind of measuring satisfaction from customers on an ongoing and a real-time basis. However, like Radhika said, that does not necessarily always translate to HR. And then if you ask the same business leaders, like, hey, what's your most important asset? Well, my most important asset is typically my employees, because my employees are the ones creating the value for the customers to begin with. And so what are we doing to measure feedback, or at least even gather feedback? Forget about engagement, forget about all this stuff. Is there a mechanism to actively keep the pulse within an organization? And that has been, in our mind at least, has been completely lacking. Like Radhika said, once you can't really kind of do any kind of meaningful kind of behavioral analysis with a once a year measurement model, and then say like, look, things are rapidly changing. Within a year, companies get spun out, built, and even destroyed, frankly, within a course of 12 months. And if the mechanism of measurement is only once a year, then clearly there is something incorrect. So that's kind of the fundamental kind of one of the fundamental concepts that we believe in, is kind of measurement has to be done continuous, has to be real time, and more importantly, the data has to flow to the right people at the right place at the right time. If that does not happen, then your odds of finding issues, your odds of kind of encouraging issues are extremely low. And one of the things, the quote over here from Jane McGonigal, and she wrote a book around gamification within the enterprise, and very interesting kind of concepts where she brought about the concepts of gamification, concepts of kind of engagement within the enterprise, within work, is a good quote to kind of understand, really, to say like, okay, we do work, but we need to be engaged, and we need to kind of think about work as part and parcel of who we are and what we are doing, and that's an important concept. Let's go on to the next slide over here. And what we've seen and what we've done with our customers over the last year and a half through our Pulse app has been pretty phenomenal with some clients, where we've kind of enabled our customers to kind of give for their employees to give real-time feedback on a weekly basis, where it's completely non-intrusive. So part of the kind of the model that we've chosen is to make sure it's completely app-based and completely push notification and targeted towards kind of that age group that Radhika and David talked about, in terms of the 25 to 35 and 25 to 40-year-old, where everybody has effectively a smartphone, has the capacity to kind of interact with the smartphone in real time at a different, and in pretty much anywhere they feel like interacting, and that's an important concept that needs to be bought into the enterprise effectively. A lot of companies in the States have kind of frankly embraced it very wholeheartedly, and said that what a once a year model is not going to work for us, and we need not that the once a year survey, the deep dive survey, is not important. It is important to give us directional guidance over a longer time horizon, but on an operational level, we need another tool, we need another system, we need another program in play, so that we have a pulse within, a pulse check within the organization. And we call it, we call it like a temperature check. So if you think about it, if you go to a doctor, the first thing that they'll do is check your pulse and check your temperature. That, that gives everybody an idea of what's going on. They may not understand exactly why something is wrong, but if something is wrong, then you know that either your temperature is high and your heart rate, and your pulse is obviously off. So one of the things that we do effectively is kind of move away from not necessarily move away, but augment rather the annual employee engagement surveys with weekly pulse check-ins, and we make it. Our goal over here is to make it extremely fluid and extremely simple, where every week employees get a single question. They can rate it with a smiley face, yes, no, maybe, and then they can add in some comments. And more importantly, so that not only the data collection is extremely fluid, the data dissemination is also fluid, like Radhika said, waiting for 3 months to produce a report is too slow and is not actionable. Whereas if I run a pulse survey on Friday, and if I can go to all the managers get another report on Monday about how, at least for the people that report up to them, and so what is the general mood, what are the general issues associated with it, and what's going on. That gives the managers effective intelligence for all the people that report up to them, and they can model and change behavior. They can address issues, and more importantly, this provides a kind of a very technology enabled forum for people to give feedback. And feedback is one of the fundamental tenets of engagement, in concept at least, where people are engaged if they believe that they can give feedback, and that feedback is actioned within a reasonable amount of time. So that's what we've done in the last year and a half or so.
Yeah, that's great, Vivek. Thank you for that. And I mean, just to summarize this, I mean, if you're an organization that does a once a year or once in 2 years survey, kudos to you. We've been on your side. We've been in HR and organizations, and we know the amount of time and effort it takes. But also think again about smarter, cheaper, more effective ways of getting that sort of sense check from your organizations. And if you're kind of starting off looking at engagement or well-being or happiness, then technology and sort of real-time feedback is definitely the way to go. So I think both sides, these are things to consider, and technology can do amazing things nowadays. So that's definitely something to talk about.
Okay, so the fact two, or the insight number two that we want to focus on is, I think, in some ways, dealing with our clients in HR in particular, I think HR sometimes tries to take too much on its shoulders in terms of coming up with the solutions for some of the challenges and opportunities that the organizations face. So our insight here is that actually a lot of the solutions, particularly around employee engagement, are about a shift from human resources solutions to trying to create organizations with more resourceful human beings inside them. And I think this fits very well with the young population profile that we have in the Middle East, because we see, certainly from a millennial point of view, there's much more of a focus on personal accountability, personal responsibility, and having an opportunity to shape your working life or your experience and where you feel you can really add most. So I think the most fundamental issue with our current approach to engagement is that sometimes they can appear to be too passive. So if you feel like your engagement survey is getting into a little bit of a trope around every year we run this survey, every year we ask people, what do you think about your manager? What do you think about your training? What do you think about the food in the staff canteen? Then actually that can create some unintended negative consequences where people answer the questionnaire. It creates an expectation that somebody, probably HR, is going to do something about those things. So if I don't like cheese and onion sandwiches and they're always on the menu of the staff canteen, and I've told you that last year and I told you again this year, but they're still on the menu, then actually can drive dissatisfaction and disengagement as much as the potential for positive upside. I also think that it's very one-sided in the sense that it talks a lot about what the organization or somebody, or in again many cases human resources, are going to do and take accountability for the action planning, rather than understanding a little bit more about what is the individual's role in managing their own engagement, and also what are their aspirations when they walk in your office every day. What is it they're looking to achieve, and how can we get a better match, which essentially is the root of the word engagement, right? A match, two sides coming together between what the organization offers and what the individual is looking to achieve.
Yeah.
So I think, again, very much, this sort of short-term hedonistic approach to particularly, rewards rather than recognition, and the balance being too much on that side. Also, I think we're seeing the unintended negative consequences of that in terms of supporting individual aspirations, individual accountability. Also, I think another big shift we're seeing in engagement, just like in performance management processes, is that I think smarter organizations are now starting to say, well, this process tells us just about as much as the impact of managers as well as the role of individuals. So what is the nested analysis that we can do of the impact of a manager on their team, on their colleagues, and are they having a disproportionately positive or disproportionately toxic impact in the organization and in the contacts that they're having?
Just to add, I think there's some really key things here. So, I mean, if you look at most surveys that we're all familiar with, I mean, typically you'll have questions on aspects that measure engagement, and then they'll have what you call HR drivers or organizational drivers. And like David said, if you ask employees for their opinion on, are you happy with training? Are you happy with your manager? Are you happy with your career development? Most often people will say no, or kind of show some level of dissatisfaction. And then the buck clearly passes on to HR or to management to do something about it. So, and I think there's that third point here is really important, that third and fourth point actually, that when the source of your own personal engagement or happiness for that matter is external, when you expect your manager or your HR or your management team or your leadership team to do something constantly to motivate you, to kind of get you to be committed, then it's a very fragile relationship, because high expectations lead to high disappointment, which obviously creates sort of this downward spiral. So, I mean, I guess very simply we're saying it is as much about the employee and sort of what they bring to the table in terms of engagement, and concepts like the amount of discretionary effort you're willing to put in, or the amount of time you're willing to commit to your organization, is quite internal as well. It really does come from your own sort of personal space. And when you make it too much about what HR or the organization can do for you, it creates a very, very passive approach to engagement, which needs to shift. So yeah, something to think about around sustainability, right? So really creating that culture where employees are self-motivated, they believe in where they are, they believe in the purpose, and really shifting from HR to resourceful humans, which could be a whole different webinar series, I think. The other thing which we've been actually questioning, and I don't know if you've seen or heard about what we call an interesting concept in psychology called the hedonic treadmill, which basically was based on a lot of classical psychology research around adaptation theory, saying that, and one classic experiment was scientists studied happiness levels of people who won lotteries, so lottery winners and paraplegics, so people who actually got disabled or went through sort of trauma through an accident, and they kind of had the opportunity to measure happiness for them before they had this positive or negative life event, and then during, and then after. And what was, I mean, in very, very simple terms, what they found was that every individual has a happiness set point. So if you won a lottery, you might kind of go through this massive peak in terms of your happiness, and you have this amazing feeling. But then over time, after a year, 2 years, or 3 years, your happiness levels come down to what is your average level of happiness. And the question we're increasingly asking ourselves, and the same thing actually for negative. So when you experience trauma, when you go through negative events, you also have a negative, a set point for happiness. If you're generally sort of a optimistic, positive person, you'll kind of recover from your trauma most times, and then come back to your sort of set point level of happiness. So it really talks about adaptation. And the question we're really asking is it realistic for organizations to expect happiness or engagement, I think, as a construct or measure to constantly increase? Is there a set point to how much you can expect your employees to be engaged? So abstract terms, if your score is 50, can it actually get to 100? And will it ever get to 100? Or is your set point 70 or 65, right? And the more you start doing this ongoing pulse checks, where you start to look at trends by month or by date, in terms of the more intelligence and information you get around your engagement without depending on a once a year sort of measure, you'll start to figure out realistically what you can impact when it comes to someone's employee engagement or happiness, and actually what you can't control. And is there really a set point? And do we have realistic expectations around engagement in the first place?
Okay, so just to share a little bit more from the fourth perspective in terms of our model at the Talent Enterprise of employee engagement. So we have this equilibrium model. What we're saying is what we see that drives employee engagement more broadly is both personal dimensions and organizational dimensions. And both in balance with each other are what leads to organizational results. So if you look on the left-hand side of this, we're talking more about the personal sources of engagement. So we're saying often this gets missed from many traditional measures of employee engagement, which focus more on the organizational side. What can the organization do to drive engagement? So often this comes about trying to get a balance between what the individual resources are. So this could be psychological resources, their own personal strengths and orientation and motivation and aspirations for work. How prepared are they in terms of their mindset and expectations? What's their orientation to work? Also very practical things like what resources do they have available in order for them to achieve results. The impact of work demand is also very interesting, right? And again, we see that this is often on a scale. So just as demotivating and problematic for employee engagement as burnout, which would be the extreme end of work demands, where there's too many work demands, is the negative impact of boredom. Okay, so if there are not enough work demands, if there's not enough challenge in the work that you do, then this can be just as equally disengaging as having too much demand. And I think this often, again, gets missed when we just look at it from the organization perspective. So if you do have those high potential people or those highly aspirational people, actually, in many cases, they need more positive, constructive challenges in order to achieve engagement for them. And then obviously you've got the things like the physical work environment, thinking about the fabric of your workplace. Does it really support collaboration? Does it support communication? Does it support a productive approach to work? And all of these things together are what leads to employee engagement. So what we see is that, again, often the recipe is very consistent, the ingredients are consistent, but the actual specific balance of these within each industry, within each region, within each organization is slightly different. But it does have very tangible impact on measurable outcomes which impact the bottom line, like not only discretionary effort and productivity, but absenteeism, turnover, sickness absence, etc., etc.,
yeah.
etc.
And it's really interesting when you actually start to track and measure what we call personal engagement, which is the individual's personal engagement or commitment, and organizational, we actually start to see differences. So classic example, you could be, working in a healthcare organization, and you love being there because you genuinely believe in kind of helping other people or interested in advancing the medical field. So you could have extremely high personal engagement, which I guess goes back to the purpose and the flow aspects we were talking around happiness. But then you could be working for a very dysfunctional organization, but continue to be engaged, continue to put discretionary effort. So this would be a case where personal engagement would be quite high, but organizational engagement in terms of what the organization is doing could be quite low. And the other example could be where you're working for a great tech company, right? I mean, Vivek's based in that sort of area where you could be working for a great organization that provides you all the benefits you need and all the flexibility you need, but you are just one part or a cog in the wheel, right? So you're one coder, one developer in a very, very big organization, and maybe you don't get that sense of purpose or that sense of connection to the bigger picture. So in this sort of an organization or environment, your organizational engagement could be very high, but sort of your personal motivation may or may not get impacted. So when you start looking at these things together and looking at the balance between the two, that's what makes it tick for the long term.
Yeah, and just before we move on to the next point, I think the interesting thing, whilst this may look very complex in terms of the nature of drivers of organizational employee engagement and the personal also, I think the thing we constantly remind our clients about is that, again, this parallel between what do we know about our staff and our team and our colleagues compared to what do we know about our customers. Now, often the organization prioritizes doing analysis of customer information and doing that for marketing purposes, etc. But actually, we know far more about our people through many different data touch points. I would say from a CEO's perspective, often the challenge is, what are we doing with that information, right? Of course, we've got to protect confidentiality, but we collect so many different data points on our people, and we've got so much history on our people, that we can really start to uncover what are the specific drivers and what are the patterns of engagement from a much stronger, richer field of data than we can often from the starting point of looking at customers. So I think that's an interesting parallel also. So moving on, I think from fact 4, what we're seeing is, again, this focus on certain individuals or individual factors driving employee engagement just as much importantly as organizational engagement. So in the longer term, if you want to drive higher levels of employee engagement, then the answer is about recruiting, developing, retaining, promoting more engaged individuals. Okay, so whilst you can work on the organizational side and improving the context and the environment for engagement, just as important and often overlooked is what are we doing to make sure we've got more engaged people within the organization. What you're seeing in front of you here is a range of different psychometric factors from some of our psychometric tools at the Talent Enterprise. And we find that 40% of employee engagement is determined or explained in some of our regression analysis by these individual factors. And in many cases has nothing to do with the organization. Okay, if you think about that and you think about the efforts that you might be undertaking or you've undertaken in the past on employee engagement, for a significant proportion of your team, it has no impact. Okay, so again, to go back to what Radhika was saying, we can all think of examples of this, right? We think of our restaurant we've been to, or I guess from a British perspective, the obvious example is the National Health Service, right? In many cases, it's a very dysfunctional organization. Okay, it doesn't really work, it's bureaucratic, it's not orientated towards the needs of the customer. And yet, within those organizations, you find very, very engaged individuals who have a sense of purpose and a sense of inspiration and aspiration, and they will put in the discretionary effort to help you to navigate a very dysfunctional system.
Yeah.
Okay, and what we're saying is often part of the answer to having a very direct impact on improving your employee engagement is finding out more about the attributes of those people and getting more people like that, right? Yeah. Do they have the resilience? Can they deal with ambiguity? Are they focused on intrinsic motivation? Do they have a growth mindset, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And then almost regardless of the organizational context, these people will put in that discretionary effort and they will demonstrate the visible attributes of being engaged.
Yeah, so that's great, David. And just, I guess, to summarize what we've been saying, because I know there's a lot that we've said in the last 20 minutes or so. I think the first thing really is the fact that figure out your measurement, try and have sort of a more ongoing way of capturing sort of the pulse of the organization. The second is, just don't look at the organizational aspect and don't create or try to reduce this one-sided approach to engagement where it's the organization's responsibility or the HR's responsibility to do something about employee engagement or happiness for that matter on a yearly or a regular basis. And the third aspect is around the set point we spoke about, and also the fact that 40% of your engagement score or whatever you're looking to measure actually has nothing to do with you. It's really got to do with the individual and their personal attributes and their strengths that they bring to work. So we're happy to share more research on any of this. If you have interest, we'll be sharing the slides, but also sharing our contact details. If you're interested a little bit more around some of this predictive analytics we've done around which personal attributes contribute to engagement, we'd be happy to share more. So the last bit is to summarize. So I guess there is an advantage of everything we've done in engagement over the last 20, 25 years or so, because we do know what organizational aspects drive engagement. And again, going back to what Vivek and I were talking about earlier, is the fact that when you are experiencing or feeling positively about your organization or about yourself, it leads to these upward spirals. You start to feel positive emotions, which leads to you kind of being more creative, being more expansive, being, more collaborative. So it leads to these positive aspects. But if you start to look at what aspects of, and this might not be new to you, but really the research is very simple, and it really says that I mean, there's classic psychological theory called the self-determination theory, which has got popularized by people like Dan Pink, who talk about autonomy, mastery, and relatedness. So when you start to experience greater autonomy at work, whether it's things like feeling empowered, getting responsibility, feeling much more connected to the organization and sort of communication, when you're experiencing or feeling like you're growing. So a lot of what Vivek was saying around the fact that you feel like you're learning on the job, career growth, so you kind of feel you're progressing and you're being recognized and valued for what you do. Those are extremely important drivers of engagement. The other one is around relatedness. So in positive psychology, one of the most popular sort of notions is around other people matter. So whether it's your manager, whether it's the senior leaders that inspire you within your organization, whether it's sort of that feeling of trust and collaboration within the workplace, relatedness is a really important part of impacting positively or negatively the engagement of your staff and your employees. And the last bit we spoke about earlier is purpose. Do you feel connected to, do you feel aligned to the bigger purpose? Are your personal values aligned to what the organization is trying to do? And do you feel that sense of accomplishment? And if you look at these aspects very simply, this is what drives the sustained engagement we were talking about. Very, very quickly, you've got these positive and negative signs below each aspect. So I guess it goes back to the classic hygiene factors and motivators. Some of these are hygiene factors. If you don't have enough communication, for example, or if you don't have enough responsibility or enough of that sense of purpose, it really negatively impacts engagement. So if you have engagement, it would start falling off a cliff. You'd start to see a decline in scores. But what would really lead to increased engagement would be things like career growth, career progression, connection to your manager, inspirational senior leadership. That has a very, very, probably the highest, single highest positive impact on employee engagement in the region is around the leaders and how much do you feel they're really role models to what you want to do. So a lot to think about here, but it really boils down to these 3 or 4 concepts around autonomy, mastery, relatedness, and that sense of purpose. So we're going to take anything to add to this?
Yeah, no, I think we are kind of running out of time. I do have a couple of questions coming up from the audience, and I would love kind of for you guys to kind of chime in on these questions. So we've talked obviously about figuring out kind of one of the, how to measure it, but let's say you are an HR manager and you want to kind of pitch this idea or pitch kind of a couple of different programs to your senior management. How do you go about kind of, David, especially, maybe you can chime in. How do you go about kind of, deconstructing this and really kind of going back to senior management or kind of the C-suite and saying that, we need to run a couple of different programs around measurement as well as execution of engagement. In your experience, what has worked and what has not worked? Can you speak to that?
Sure. So I think from a practical perspective, I think there's probably 2 broad strategies that I've seen be successful. I think particularly when you're trying to persuade and compel senior managers to get behind an initiative. I think one is from an employee engagement perspective. I think unless you're really investing in a very analytical approach, following some of the principles that we've discussed today, then I think you can frame this as a missed opportunity that needs to be addressed. Because I think, again, we have so much data about our people, also need to respect confidentiality, etc. We can do so much with that information. It can be augmented and triangulated with a traditional survey or with more of an app-based pulse type survey, or as many different combinations of that as possible. And we can really get some insights into what specific behaviors are driving engagement, what factors really work to promote employee well-being amongst managers in particular. How do we drive productivity? What are the life cycles of people's engagement? We've even done some interesting work in terms of trying to analyze that in a little bit more detail. So I think it's a missed opportunity, and if you're not doing it, then maybe your competition are doing it, and that sort of conversation tends to wake up people in the C-suite. I think the other approach is very much to say, well, look, okay, what can we do to be smarter in our analytics that give us not just sort of analysis paralysis and a sort of annual report of the nature that we talked about today, but actually giving us some insights in what drives performance and productivity in our organization. So for instance, whatever you can do, and what we've done, I know there's plenty of examples from the QuestionPro perspective as well, is what is it that is enabling us to get more people into the organization who are performing, who are thriving in our organization? Where do they come from? How do we get more people like that? What do we need to do to develop more people like that? What initiatives do we need to have in place to secure that talent? What analysis can we do on the impact of managers in driving engagement? So again, this nested analysis, looking for those positive impacts that managers have with people around them, or on the more pessimistic approach, what is the toxic impact of individuals who are disengaged, particularly as we move up the hierarchy of the organization. More specifically, we can talk about the cost of disengagement. So for instance, we've got a series of questions that we use called the attrition risk index in some of our engagement projects with our clients, and this helps us to predict the likelihood that somebody could be vulnerable to leaving the organization, and also the timelines. So therefore that enables organizations to take initiatives on a proactive basis to try and to deal with those situations. So I think very broadly, it's a missed opportunity if you're not doing it in a smart and analytical way, and that often can be compelling. And then secondly, I think, let's get more in depth. Let's use some of the smart tools that we have available, whether it's about analytics more broadly or some of the software that we have available to us, to really get some data-driven insights that enable us to take action where it has the most impact.
Great, thank you so much. We're running out of time, and I have one last question, and this is for Radhika. I mean, the GCC is an interesting kind of part of the world where, obviously there is the huge population is expat, or is a significant population of expat, which is distinctly different than pretty much, I think, anywhere else in the planet, at least when it comes to the workforce, and so do you guys see kind of a distinct difference in terms of how people, what models to use in the GCC that's different than, say, in the US or UK or Australia, where obviously the population difference is, whereas, locals versus expats is completely not skewed the way it is in the GCC. So can you speak to that as there are obviously two different kinds of models, at least physical models, and do you guys have to kind of think about it differently when you do the research?
Sure. I mean, Vivek, that's a really interesting question, and I'll try and just answer it very quickly because I know we're running out of time, and I don't think I can do justice to it completely. But I mean, just to summarize, to say that the GCC is a very segmented labor market, right? So there are sort of internal segments within your organizations, but also externally. It's very segmented. There's a very, even from a policy perspective, right? Expatriates don't end up staying here for too long. There is no such thing as citizenship or long-term or permanent residency. So that creates a very interesting dynamic within the workplace, whether it's around a lack of ownership or a lack of long-term commitment from expatriates who work here, and also for nationals who are kind of continuing to come into the workplace with their own motivations, their own sort of contribution and sort of building towards community. So it's a very interesting dynamic within the workplace that we don't see elsewhere. And we've worked in, fast growth emerging markets a fair bit over the last decade. And it's a very specific sort of labor market here. It's also very traditional. So we're also talking about organizations that are not as advanced, probably not as transparent around communication or around sort of people processes generally. So it's also kind of where we're coming from and where the base is. And I think thirdly, there's a lot of demographic changes. We have not just, the multiple cultures that work here, and each one comes from its sort of own cultural context and expectations, but a huge sort of youth workforce. We have more females coming into work. So also thinking about engagement, not just from a broad perspective, but also demographically, what are the different drivers and motivators for engagement? So just one quick, narrative. We were speaking to some, young people in an organization last week, some graduates we're working with, and they said coming into work feels like going into the sets of Jurassic Park, right? Where everything's outdated and it's not kind of what they used to. So there's sort of the overall, the government sort of, or the policy context, there is the organizational context, typically quite traditional, trying to move very, very fast towards the future, but also sort of the individual aspects and demographics. So I think when David talked about the fact that there is, the GCC has one of the lowest levels of employee engagement in the world, it's the more time you spend here, it's understandably so. And I think there's a lot more, in the positive sense, there's a lot more that can be done to kind of switch and improve employee engagement levels drastically over the next 3 to 5 years.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we have just about run out of time. Once again, David and Radhika, it's a pleasure always working with you. It's a pleasure to listen and absorb all the research you guys have done. It's beautiful. Thank you so much.